Welcome again to Small Night Zine. As you can see, there's lots of screen prints. I think you can see there's lots of large screen prints hanging around me, and it's blocking out the one light I have over there. So the light is very different from previous episodes. Anyway, I'm going to talk about two things today. One is the introduction to this text, unofficially called The Poetic Life, and the other is about my other Instagram profile, A Flash in the Small Night. I have two profiles on Instagram. One is for this, Small Night Zine, and the other is A Flash in the Small Night. The Flash in the Small Night came out of reading some reviews on Dublin shows recently. And after the first paragraph of one of these reviews, I got bored and I didn't continue reading. I knew where the review was going. It felt like there was a lot of unnecessary content and a lot of unnecessary build-up, information that I wasn't really interested in. So that got me to read some of my own recent reviews. And I really got a sense that I could cut them down. So I saw Instagram as a good way of doing it, in that you only can write 2,200 characters in a caption. So that gave me a limiter for the reviews, the texts I was going to write. And I felt a lot of liberty in that, in a weird sense, because I've been conditioned over the years to write, between 800, 1,000 word reviews, and then if you're doing essays, they're a little bit longer, they're 2,000 or 3,000 words. So I was conditioned to write in this way, and there's a certain type of momentum in that type of review, and I just got bored with it. So A Flash in the Small Night is a way of limiting all the unnecessary baggage that some of the traditional and conventional reviews take in relation to word count and just tone and mood and speed of text. In the Instagram profile, Flash in the Small Night, there's a lot of play with words, and I feel there's a lot of freedom in it to play with things. I'm still empathetic to the artist and their work, of course, and I'm trying to get to a level within their work that they may not have thought about, or some images or words that may not have come up in their own vernacular, their own dialect in relation to their work. So that's one thing. The other is The Poetic Life. I wrote this a few months ago after watching Jim Jarmusch's film Paterson, and it's really a poem. The action or lack of action takes place over the course of a week, and I felt it was quite a beautiful film. It really inspired me, and it really inspired me to look up William Carlos Williams again and start to read his poetry again. I think I have two books here. This was a gift by someone, his letters. It's the first edition. It's a beautiful book, and it's so interesting. His letters to his mother, and letters to other poets as well. You get a real sense of him. You could say he has quite an ego, and then in his poetry, there's a sense that the ego is removed. This is a lovely little book, The Red Wheelbarrow and Other Poems, and it's very has some of his most well-known poems. It starts off with "This is just to say," which is I suppose narrated in the poem. It's performed by Adam Driver, who's the character, who's the protagonist in Jim Jarmusch's film. He's a poet, and he reads this in the kitchen to his wife. I'll just read it out. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you are probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. That's it. So throughout the film, these poems are recited by the main character, Adam Driver, And what it inspired me in relation to this text is this idea of the poetic life. The poetic life being engaged, of course, we've used this term, the everyday, even IKEA use it now, but the everyday as something that is exciting and marvelous. But in this, there's something also beyond, theories of the everyday and how artists use that to the point of saturation today. It's much more, it's about a quiet life, and it's about, in a sense, a lack of ambition, a lack of growing up. The female protagonist, the wife of Adam Driver, of Paterson in the movie, is quite a retrograde portrait of the artist, or of the woman in the home. She sits at home, painting, sewing, making cupcakes, and he goes out. He's a bus driver, and he returns home, and he makes all the money. And it's quite a retrograde portrait. And there is a feminist critique in there, definitely, of that portrait. But beyond that, beyond those kind of, explicit kind of, I suppose, criticisms of the film, there is something inspiring about their life. In some ways, I relate to the wife at home being lost as an artist, not knowing what to do next, more so than the male protagonist who goes out and does a job and then writes poetry while waiting to start up the engine of the bus again. And he picks moments throughout his working day to write these poems that are related to his everyday life. And they're quite beautiful poems, very simple and very William Carlos Williams. And there's a lot of reincarnations in this film, I think. The wife is a reincarnation of Hilda Doolittle, who was a poet around the same time as William Carlos Williams, and she was a very big inspiration. She was quite quirky, and she was a really big inspiration to all those poets, those male poets that we know and that are in the canon today, but kind of, in a sense, invisible again. And there's the critique. When I think about this film, I think about the art scene, and I think about the professionalization of the art scene and the art administration. I see this as a kind of a critique of that, of that picture, that we kind of have a very happy life as artists if we have love and affection, and that we don't need anything beyond that. Of course, we have to live. And in this, I talk about the threadbare nature of the life of the artist, and that's enough. And if we can get by on that, if we have that, and if we can survive, then we can make great art. But it is a very romantic idea of the artist, and we all have to live. We all have to have food. We all have to kind of have some fun outside of just surviving. So there's a lot of romanticism in this text about the artistic life, the poetic life, which are all the same thing, I think. But I think ambition, professional ambition, careers, this was something I never got as an artist. One of my first days in art college, I was given this lecture by Mick Wilson, and he said, if you're here for a career, you might as well leave. I accepted that the first day. Okay, I know where I stand now. So for me, it was a release. It was kind of liberating to hear that from a lecturer. And then I moved on, and I didn't expect to have a career or live on what I was doing. Just to get by. To get by was enough. And if you were happy, then so be it. Then just live like that. If you weren't happy, then give up being an artist. That is a kind of a brutal, kind of binary decision. It's black and white. But for me, being an artist, you really need to be happy and loved and get affection from somewhere to keep on doing what we are doing. So without further ado, this is the text. The poetic life. There's two ways of looking at this. One, I believe most artists end up living the poetic life. Two, Most artists want more than the poetic life can ever promise. Desire and conflict is a means to continuity, to living, to a life. What does the poetic life offer anyway? It is my contention that the poetic life is the life we ought to be living as artists, no matter how threadbare that life might be. And the more beyond the poetic life will never live up to its billing. Let me tell you why. In recent years, I've had several conversations with artists who have retreated from the art scene proper, Dublin. Some feel betrayed by the art scene as if it didn't live up to its promise, a promise of the artist's ideological making. Others just got fed up of what they grew to perceive as a smell of bullshit. The art scene is something you come to understand and know over a period of time. If exposed to the art scene for long enough, you get to know its players and its patterns, its synaptic connections like a big fat tender brain. Tenderized, the studio life of an artist is crossed with the social life of the artist. So work and play become indivisible in an instrumental way of thinking and desiring about becoming an artist. In an environment lacking in resources and opportunities, it's only common Darwinian, Marxist, Freudian sense that the same environment will not be lacking in opportunists. Artists will dismiss their networking capabilities offhand, but they have no real choice or insight into the hydraulics of their own desires and ambitions in an environment that is machined by professional sociability. The question is, what is the alternative to the ice-white casino at the centre with its redwoods and weeping willows and perennial weeds? Let me answer by telling you a story about a story. Last week I watched Jim Jarmusch's film Paterson, wherein the poetic life is portrayed as symbiotic and synergistic with the workaday life. Paterson's protagonist is a young bus driver named Paterson living in the city of Paterson. Duality plays out like a superhero movie here as our poet bus driver heroically performs without cape or spectacles what David Foster Wallace calls the day in, day out of ordinary life, against the backdrop of what Adam Phillips calls the fantasy of the unlived life. His stay-at-home wife paints her house and clothes. She is a black and white reincarnation of another poet, Hilda Doolittle, who inspired William Carlos Williams, yet another poet, who wrote an epic poem titled, you guessed it, Paterson. She dreams about having kids, twins, being a famous country and western singer, and seeing Paterson's poetry read by the world. She's more the mother figure of a slow-cooked son who never left home, or the retrograde portrait of the good wife. I find the scenario comforting, like back in the womb of Home Sweet Home. I'm a mama's boy, it seems. Their world seems smothered as I write it down here, but it's not. A temporal hole opens up in their world when we are proffered a glimpse of a photograph of Paterson as a Marine on the couple's bedside table in uniform in the opening sequence, which nudges us to speculate or melodramatize a history just out of frame. The poet-bus driver combo could never have come fully formed into this world. Something must have made Paterson the way he is to notice and pen down the minutiae of life and memory in such precious throwaway detail. PTSD from being a Marine is as good a reason as any. Poetry comes from trauma that shakes words loose from their regimental purpose. The fact is, the photograph of the Marine sits pride of place beside the couple's love and intimacy every morning and night for the 7 days of the film. Their life is normal. Bad dinners, good cupcakes, walking the dog, having a pint, waking up together, dreaming of the future, the silent solitude of being a bus driver surrounded by people but not obliged to perform against the loose ends of domesticity. There's a feminist critique in there, both ways, but I'm not going there. Through a neoliberal lens, you could call their life stairless, contributing nothing outside their own bungalowed ambition. Thing is, the lovely couple seemed contented happy, her with her smartphone and projects. They stave off the vertigo of freedom in the home, him with his secret notebook and simple lunchbox. They are artists, one reaching out, the other in retreat, a balancing act, equilibrium. The repeated references to William Carlos Williams in Paterson is important here. A poet, according to Linda Welchheimer, is willing to live the kind of rushed experience that would be necessary, crowding 2 lifetimes into one, learning from the first, then understanding through the second. William Carlos Williams was a doctor for 40-odd years. What's poetic about being a doctor or bus driver if, in your secret journal, you are a poet doctor or poet bus driver? It is the dual life that is poetic, one rushing into the other, one public, one under the arm private, both in plain sight if you are willing to acknowledge the possibility of normalcy being the seedbed of something poetic, something more, as the curious and empathetic Chinese man and poet does in the penultimate scene of the film, where we find Paterson wallowing in the trauma of her dog eating his journal with all that poetry that has infused the 7 days of the film. It's poetic to this fellow poet that this young man sits here on this bench, kindred souls, lost in thought, monitoring the mundane for something extra. This is poetic, taking silent stock of last night, this morning, this life, so a line can be bled from the day. It's as if poetry, New York school poetry, a la Frank O'Hara or John Ashbery, is nobler than the everyday, even though contingent on the everyday. The poet's job is to stroke the knot that is the present. I like Howard Nemirov's definition of poetry. Poetry is the other way of using language. Perhaps in some hypothetical beginning of things, it was the only way of using language, or simply was language tout court, prose being the derivative and younger rival. The language we speak today is not art speak, it's institutionalized speak, something that Derrida's deconstruction was hoping to undermine down to the molecular paradoxes and frailties of language. I summon up the Texan painter Forrest Best when I think about the poetic life, a fisherman by day, a painter of visions by night, but unlike Paterson, who is a unique case for some unique reason, Best wanted more than the poetic life could give, as he simultaneously dropped a hand on the New York art scene. Best was conflicted for a purpose beyond painting, beyond professionalism, beyond the good life. Today you are an enigma if you retreat from the art world. Martin Herbert wrote a book, Tell Them I Said No, on enigmatic artists who withdrew from the art world. On the ground, the poetic life is about just getting by, threadbare, once removed from the world, although touching it, bringing us a little closer to it at the same time. Everything promises more. The artistic life is designated as an alternative life to the mainstream life. The poetic life, as portrayed in Jim Jarmusch's Paterson, reinforces the values inherent in fostering the alternative life of the artist, free from the constraints, conditioning, and self-censorship of instrumental professionalism. Does the artist go underground or embrace a poetic life above ground, as Marcel Duchamp called on the future artist to go in the 1960s? Or does the artist keep on knocking on the joke door of the art institution? Retreat.